Piers Corbyn is I set out to find someone who is known as a leading meteorologist, astrophysicist. I mean, the degrees go on. And from all the experts I've talked to and looked at, he's one of the top forecasters who has accurately been forecasting weather at levels much more accurate than even governments and NASA and others. So he's here to explain to us today how he's been able to do that as well. Weatheraction.com. But Mr. Corbyn, the British press calls you Dr. Corbyn, but it all gets confusing with all these different scientific areas you're an expert in. But in a nutshell, tell us your main area of study about weather action and then the fraud of man-made climate change.
Yes, well, I got a first-class degree from Imperial College in physics, and then went on and did astrophysics at Queen Mary College in London. These are both in London. And I developed from that into studying the sun and how the sun affects the Earth's weather. And after some years of studying all sorts of ideas, we developed this method for long-range weather forecasting called the solar weather technique, which depends on the magnetic and particles coming from the sun and how they change circulation patterns on Earth, subject to certain modulations, such as what the moon is doing as well.
And I mean, from studying, most of the scientists we talk to more and more say the evidence is showing that the sun is one of the main drivers. But the UN, again on Monday, just declared, as if they were the Pope saying the Earth is the center of the universe and flat, they announced that the sun has nothing to do with it.
Yes, well, they would, wouldn't they? Because they have another agenda. Now, we know that what they say is failed science based on fraudulent data. And we know from our own measurements and actual experience that the sun is the main or the prime driver of all weather change on the Earth, and carbon dioxide has nothing, absolutely nothing, zero influence for whatever reason, to do with feedbacks or whatever, but it has no influence.
And am I right, Doctor, in saying it is one of the lowest trace gases in the atmosphere?
That's right, yes. There's only 1 part in 3,000 is carbon dioxide. Now, of course, they argue all sorts of critical processes, but we say, well, show us the evidence, actual observational evidence that carbon dioxide drives temperatures and extreme events, and there is none. And I was on Russian TV a few days ago pointing at somebody from the United Nations Climate Committee, the IPCC, and said, all right, if you have the evidence, email it to me. And I gave him my email address, piers@weatheraction.com, on the air. And so far he's emailed nothing, and of course he won't, because there is no evidence.
Well, most of these guys know it's fraud. I've talked to a lot of them at events, on the street, at smart growth conferences, and they just off camera laugh and say, buddy, we're getting rich. I mean, this is just a band of criminals.
It is cynical, yeah. I mean, I know some of them, you know, friends of mine in some sense, or they were friends of mine, saying, well, Piers, you know, say quite openly, you may well be right, and they might even say you are right, but I've got mouths to feed. And, you know, they'll go on this gravy train for as long as it's there, which is scandalous, of course. It's scandalous. I mean, we believe in weather action that all science and policy making has to be evidence-based. And this is not evidence-based. It's based on fraud. And as you mentioned, there's been a whole lot of revelations coming out of the fraud, not just that the University of East Anglia have been meddling with data to make their bizarre little models fit history and rub out the medieval warm period. But we now know, for example, in New Zealand, data was chosen so that although the real data showed a falling of temperatures of 0.7 degrees centigrade per century, they fiddled it to turn it into a rising of 1.2 degrees per century. And we now know that in Russia, they selected Russian weather stations to choose the ones which were nearest to what they wanted. So they threw away 75% of the Russian data. and the Russians nicely announced this a few days ago, at the same time as a cold blast of air whacked through Copenhagen to England, bringing blizzards on the way at the same time as Obama landed. And we, in fact, at Weather Action had forecasted just these blizzards in detail from 30 days ahead, although the general idea is we often forecast from longer ahead.
Now, one of their favorite tricks is you have hundreds of thousands of different sub-weather systems, according to what I've read. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they will just pick one little area that's having extreme weather, but you're always, out of thousands of different areas, going to be able to find a few areas that are having extreme weather. That is normal.
Absolutely, yes. You see, because, every town and city has got a maximum and minimum of wet, an amount of rainfall, amount of sunshine, and so on. So you go around the world, in any year or month, you can find somebody who's got an extreme and you can announce it, which, of course, isn't just nonsense. Whereas at Weather Action, from a long time ahead, we can announce periods, very short periods, around the world where there will be a whole lot of simultaneous, more or less simultaneous, weather extreme events, which happened, for example, from the 17th to 19th of November this year. There were enormous storms and deluges in the USA, in Africa, India, Australia, and Europe. And we predicted those a long time ahead. So, there are real extremes going on, and those type of things they cannot predict. All they can do later, after something, is say, oh, there's an extreme, that must be CO2.
Well, shifting gears with Piers Corbyn, shifting gears, sir, why have you been so accurate with long-term forecasting at weatheraction.com?
Well, the reason why we're accurate is because we understand the essential nature of the magnetic and particle relationship which drives the Earth's weather and climate. Now, obviously, it's vastly complicated, so we don't have supercomputers to do it, or models, which, just like financial models, would go wrong. What we're able to do is understanding the periods of the forcing factors and the changing forcing factors, is we can identify when in the past there were very similar Sun-Earth magnetic forcing factors affecting the world as there will be at some time in the future.
So by knowing the past, you know the future, understanding the science.
Exactly. The point we make is there's nothing new happening. All the weather you see now has happened before sometime. We just have to identify when in the past is going to be very similar to sometime in the future. And it might be 40 years ago, it might be 100 years ago, but we have ways which are quite mathematically clever of finding out. Now,
have you read about John P. Holdren, the White House science czar, who's also involved in the ClimateGate emails? See, he says they're going to save us. They're always saving us from something new. He says with geoengineering or terraforming, he says they're doing tests to manipulate the weather. The Russians, the Chinese, they all claim they can control the weather. In your modeling, I know you're looking at the entire planet, the sun, the particles, the nuclei coming in from space. But do you ever see anything weird going on because of some of the weather modification testing?